Poème Symphonique is a piece composed for 100 mechanical metronomes by Hungarian composer György Ligeti. Last week, I had the opportunity to perform Poème Symphonique at Loop, which is a music conference held by Ableton in Berlin. Us volunteer performers were given some basic instructions, which were loosely interpreted from Ligeti's original score. Each of us were going to be responsible for 8 or so mechanical metronomes. We were instructed to set all of our metronomes to different tempos. It didn't matter which tempos we set them to, so long as they were all different from one another. And then once we did that, we would wind them up, and on cue, we would set them all off at the same time. The resulting cacophony of all of this reverberated down a long, curved hallway. Ligeti's music is probably best known to the general public because of its inclusion in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. His compositions are a perfect fit to Kubrick's sprawling visual narrative. These truly haunting sounds that Ligeti was able to create rely heavily upon something that he called micro-polyphony, a dense web of interconnected and sometimes microtonal melodies that create a blurry harmonic aesthetic. Ligeti would write, "You hear a kind of impenetrable texture, something like a very densely woven cobweb. The polyphonic structure does not come through. You cannot hear it. It remains hidden in a microscopic, underwater world, to us, inaudible." Poème Symphonique is kind of like the rhythmic version of micro-polyphony. You get a vague sense that there's some sort of underlying order to the rhythms, but you can't quite make it out. It remains kind of this rhythmic soup. Your brain can't help but look for patterns, however. This is known in psychology as apophenia, our desire to create meaning out of pure chaos. Often this takes the form of seeing human faces when there aren't any there. The patterns are just a matter of consequence, but we'll still try to imbue them with meaning. Since the metronomes used in Poème Symphonique are mechanical and need to be wound, they'll slowly start dying off after a matter of minutes. As they stop, one by one, you can slowly start to make sense of it all. The musical picture becomes clearer and clearer, or at least less shrouded in complexity. One thing I started noticing is large-scale polyrhythms between 2 individual metronomes. Depending on the tempo, they'll slowly slide in and out of phase, and so what I started doing is ascribing rhythmic relationships along the way. Eighth notes will slide into swung eighth notes, will slide into kind of like a dotted rhythm, and eventually back into a rhythmic unison. The thing that this reminded me of is kind of like when you're stopped at a stoplight with your turn signal on, looking at the car in front of you who also has theirs on. The signals between the 2 cars will inevitably slide in and out of sync. When we try and assign a rhythmic value to these turn signals, is it kind of a musical apophenia? Are we trying to give musical meaning to something out there in the real world that never had intentional meaning to begin with? Maybe. I mean, if you're cynical about it, you could think of this and the Poème Symphonique as kind of the musical equivalent of seeing the Virgin Mary in a piece of toast. Now, traditionally, the way that the Poème Symphonique is performed is just with a bunch of metronomes on a stage. Performing this piece in a long hallway added another element that Ligeti hadn't originally accounted for, and that's music in space. As you move up and down the hallway, new polyrhythmic relationships between the metronomes emerge and might take on more importance depending on how close you are to the sound source. There's also something vaguely menacing about walking down a long, dimly lit hallway with 100 metronomes ticking by. It's almost like you're walking through Hades, and the metronomes along the wall are like clocks, ticking down the time that the mortals up above have before they're called down into the underworld. As the metronomes die off, you can almost imagine the people up above dying off as well. One by one, all of the metronomes fall. Eventually, we gathered around one final metronome ticking along in a dark corner at the end of the hallway at an ominous 66 beats per minute. Several moments later, it gasped its final breath. Now, I totally understand if all of this seems a bit pretentious to you. The polite clapping at the end, the score, calling it Poème Symphonique as if it's some sort of grand symphonic poem. It seems like some sort of like postmodern nonsense, like the musical equivalent to a splatter painting. But here's the thing. It was honestly a lot of fun to perform and listen to. Who wouldn't want to see what would happen if you set off 100 metronomes in a hallway all at once? It was a grand scale rainy day exercise come to life over a couple of beers and a sense of adventure. Like other conceptual pieces, like John Cage's silent piece 4 minutes and 33 seconds, it requires a healthy dose of the absurd in order to embrace. They're kind of fun because they don't really make any sense, and it's all about the process of doing the thing. You kind of have to see it done live in order to get a feel of what they mean, and they might not actually mean anything. Searching for the meaning in the chaos is kind of the point, but you have to go into it with an open mind. Now, unfortunately, at the time of its original performance in 1963, not that many people had an open mind. Its premiere was recorded and scheduled to be broadcast on Dutch television, but after the final tick-tock of the metronome, there was a heavy silence, followed by booing, screaming, and threats. The concert was never broadcast. Instead, a soccer game was broadcast. Oh well. Now, Ligeti survived the absolute worst that the 20th century had to offer, first with the Holocaust, and then with Stalinist-era communism in his native Hungary. You can't fault him for trying to make sense of the horrors that he witnessed and his loss. You can't fault him for a sense of creative apophenia, trying to find patterns in the chaos. Through this lens, Poème Symphonique almost becomes biographical. If you listen carefully to the tick, tick, tick of 100 metronomes, you can kind of get a sense of Ligeti's hidden, microscopic underwater world. Although you don't necessarily need to tease out the individual strands of this densely woven cobweb in order to embrace the true absurdity that is Ligeti's Poème Symphonique.